Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. Where exactly would a Tyson Fury and Anthony Joshua fight be held, if it's ever to be held? And I ask that question because Bob Arum has raised the possibility that, should it ever be staged, it has to be, or he says, must be held in the United States. And I'll go through some of his comments and a few thoughts, because my natural inclination when thinking about this fight is it's a fight that probably deserves to be in the UK for a number of reasons. And some of what Arum is saying, I just don't know if it quite rings true. But of course, you can bet your bottom dollar. Your bottom dollar is what it really lies on. This is where Arum is coming from. So his quotes: Fury is going to be made into a huge attraction in the United States, which he isn't yet. We're going to get tremendous publicity for him. He's going to fight twice this year in America. Then we'll look for early next year to match Fury with either Wilder or Joshua. But I want that fight to be held in the United States because it'll be a pay-per-view fight that'll do 2 million homes. And then he was asked, did he have a preference of Wilder or Joshua? And he said, who cares, as long as the fight is in the United States. And his rationale is that there's more money to be made by having the fight in America. Oh, definitely it would do well in England, but the money is in the United States. In England, they're going to do well, but what does well mean? They'll do 1 million homes, but they'll only get $13 a home. And there's no pay-per-view in the United States if it's in England because it's in the afternoon US time. So if you do it in the United States and you do 2 million homes, which is then 70 million into the promotion, and you can still do pay-per-view in England at 4 AM, maybe you don't do 1 million homes, you'll do 600,000, but it's a no-brainer. It's all about the Benjamins or the pounds, whatever makes the most financial sense. That's where the fight should happen. And with these comments here, the Wilder stuff, I can completely understand because he's a local fighter. He's a US-based fighter, and you can sort of market that as a US-UK thing. Usually when the home fans have a horse in the race, that can give it a bit more interest. But my problem with some of Bob Arum's statements here is I look at this and go, is it really realistic to think that Tyson Fury and Anthony Joshua, two UK fighters, could have a pay-per-view in the United States and still get 2 million pay-per-view buys? It just kind of feels overly optimistic to me, to say the least. Apart from a guy like Floyd Mayweather, and this is when you're taking in the international numbers, was doing, 4.5 million pay-per-view buys for him and Pac-Man, and also him and Conor McGregor. But aside from those kind of a couple of outliers, and remember, he was a United States fighter fighting in the United States, but take out those outliers, the only other guy that's really been doing big numbers in the United States is Canelo Alvarez, and the market seems to have been shrinking for pay-per-view over the years. So, getting 1 million buys in the United States these days on pay-per-view is actually quite a feat. And we saw recently Tyson Fury and Deontay Wilder did 300,000 buys. Obviously, the rematch, if it had been held and it would have been, next month, that probably would have done 500, 600, 700,000, maybe something like that. Probably not 1 million buys, but it would have done better than the first fight. But obviously, it had the first fight, the controversy, all the drama to fall back on to help market, the second fight, because there was unfinished business. But having two guys like Joshua and Fury fight in the United States, albeit on ESPN, on a big platform, even with a huge amount of promotion, it just feels a bit optimistic to me that you could ever get 2 million buys in the United States. Remember, boxing in the United States, we keep hearing all the time, people are always saying it's still relatively a fringe sport. It's not necessarily a mainstream sport these days, compared to 20 or 30 years ago. Whereas in the UK, if we talk about that sort of situation, boxing in recent years has sort of come back to the fore. Guys like Anthony Joshua and a number of other fighters have been in big fights, and the sport of boxing has re-emerged, and it is now, from being a somewhat fringe sport maybe 10 years ago, it's sort of more mainstream these days. And Joshua and Fury, both big stars in the UK, and they are household names. I could see that doing close to something like 2 million buys in the UK just by itself, just because it is such a big domestic fight. There is so much on the line, the rivalry. They are big names in boxing in the UK and world boxing more generally. But it feels like that's the natural home for that fight, as opposed to those two being in the United States. Because we're not talking like some sort of DAZN sort of situation here where they're just getting paid flat fees and all the money's guaranteed. The pay-per-view in the United States would generate the revenue which pays these guys. And just from the outside looking in, I'm highly skeptical that it would do 2 million buys. And if they were talking about building Deontay Wilder, having him on ESPN before he fought Tyson Fury, because that was the deal that they wanted to establish, to build his profile along with Tyson Fury's, well, wouldn't they need to do the same for Anthony Joshua? Because from what we're hearing, he's not a big name in the United States, not just yet. Obviously, the Jarrell Miller fight is going to help to some extent, but with boxing still being a fringe sport to some degree, that fight alone is not going to build his profile to the point where, you know, him and Fury, two foreign fighters, come to the US and do 2 million buys. And sure, ESPN is a big platform, 80 million subscribers, and they would be shoving it down the subscribers' throats. But at the end of the day, it would be a very expensive pay-per-view. And if boxing is a fringe sport and a lot of these casuals maybe not necessarily wanting to part with $80 or $90 or whatever, because boxing on pay-per-view in the United States is very expensive. And if these fans aren't invested in this, aren't invested in these fighters, how could they ever get to 2 million buys in the United States with two foreign fighters? And there were some Eddie Hearn quotes actually about another fight that sort of dovetail nicely into this. So talking about the Lomachenko and Crolla fight, he says, America has been the biggest market in boxing, but in the last 5 years, Britain has stolen the show. When you look at the ticket sales and the interest in shows, this fight is a good example. Lomachenko, if Lomachenko and Crolla was in the UK, it would be doing 40, 50, 60,000 fans. But when you're talking about the financial hub of boxing, that is certainly in America. Just because you generate big numbers and have good exposure does not mean that you generate interest. Lomachenko is a good example. This fight hasn't sold at all, but he's all over ESPN. They're pushing him there. He's Picasso and he's this and that. But who's interested, really? I'm not talking about the people sitting at home. I'm talking about the people on the streets. Who's talking about Lomachenko on the streets? A good example in the UK, people stop me in the streets and say, when is Joshua fighting? Who is Dillian White fighting next? Joshua Boazzi, is he the real deal? It's topical. And the problem with America is that it's not topical. People are not talking about boxing enough in the streets, in the bars, in the restaurants, in the taxis, in the Ubers. They're talking about other things. And that's the problem in America. You've got American football, you've got baseball, you've got ice hockey, you've got basketball, you've got college football, you've got all these sports that take priority over boxing. In England, it's football and boxing. And some of what Eddie Hearn is saying there, that illustrates my point. Well, I believe it does. That it could potentially be a bit of a hard sell for Joshua and Fury. I'm sure it would do okay on pay-per-view in the United States, but just pushing it for the sake of pushing it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to get people captivated, that it's going to be this event that is so massive that it just pulls all these casual fans in and convinces them to buy a hugely expensive pay-per-view. So I just don't know if it's feasible for a Joshua and Fury fight to be in the United States. Would it really do 2 million buys? I'm skeptical. Maybe it would do something closer to 1 million. I don't know. It's sort of finger in the air stuff, isn't it? But some of Bob Arum's interest in all this is obviously Tyson Fury is on a co-promotional deal with ESPN and Top Rank. So he wants the fight to be in the US because his fighter is bound to him for a couple of fights a year in the United States. And if it's with him, the promotion, obviously he's got a finger in the pie and he's going to get money and make money from that fight, and that's a prime motivation. And given he's talked about it's all about money, you know, I just wonder, is it really going to make more money in the United States as opposed to the US? And even if the answer is yes, there's another question: should the fight still be in the US because would be such a massive fight in the UK? And I'm not necessarily lobbying for one over the other, but just as an outside observer, because I'm not from the UK, I'm not from the US, I just thought that this fight would be probably the biggest heavyweight fight in British history. It would make sense to have it at a Wembley or a massive stadium, 60, 70, 80, 100,000 people. it would be an event that would captivate the UK. I believe it would, because they are household names in their own right. And in America, they're not. And some of what Hearn's comments, are people really going to get interested in two foreign fighters? I can understand Deontay Wilder already having a fan base of sorts in the United States, and people would get behind the home fighter, or potentially want to see Fury beat the home fighter, or whatever the case would be. I just kind of think this fight makes more sense. Maybe if not in a financial sense, but just sense for fans, sense for the occasion and history to be in the UK. How about you? Drop a comment, loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.